I recorded a good long lecture. John Tyler ate it, Canvas ate it, and now I have to start over again. So, come here. Bonus kitty. Alright, so I'm going to upload this. Don't sneeze. Okay. I'm going to upload this with a video from the Khan Academy about thinking like a historian. And it starts off saying, you read the material and come to a conclusion. You consider what your conclusion was and look for evidence in the material or the text to support that. And then you argue your conclusion. You argue that your perspective makes sense. That's literature in a nutshell. The thing to remember, though, in this class, I've been teaching you through sort of a historical materialist lens. What that means is we're taking a look at the material realities of moments in history in order to come to certain conclusions about the text. Literature and the criticism of literature is filled with a bunch of little approaches and sort of philosophies like that, where, that's a good example. You kind of know where you're going to end up already when you read the story, so you're looking for evidence that goes to that end, which I find really, really boring. A good example would be, let's get away from historical materialism for a minute, structuralism, which is kind of the original method of lit crit. Under structuralism, the idea is that we're looking for things that prove a truth about humanity at large. No matter where you're from, no matter who you are, this will be true. Obviously, there's some problems with that. But if I'm looking at Bartleby the Scrivener through a structuralist lens, then I'm going to be thinking, okay, what is a story, what is something that I can take away from this story that I can say would be true for all people, no matter where they are, right? Now let's think about Bartleby the Scrivener. It's a story about the workplace. We never see where these people live. We never really see what the other co-workers' home life is like. We don't know where Ginger Nut comes from. Bartleby himself fails to make friends, fails to be close to anyone, and eventually just kind of gives up on himself and starves to death. I could say that this is a story then about isolation and the dangers of being alone. And then I could do a critique that says, Bartleby warns us about the effects of social isolation and alienation. The classic interpretation is usually that a psychoanalytic one, psychological analysis, where we're figuring out why the narrator is so obsessed with Bartleby's weird behavior in the first place. Because if you think about it, motherfuckers would have just fired him normally. Can you imagine if you have a coworker who lives at your job? The motherfucker would get let go and probably arrested. So, yeah. So, we could say that about Bartleby the Scrivener. And then you just have to find the evidence and be persuasive. And that's really what literary studies come down to. How persuasive are you? To take it away from Bartleby for a second. The reason that I've approached talking to you about literature the way I have throughout the semester is to build up to this moment. We began talking about the culture, the creator, and the context of a work, specifically because we need some kind of anchor point to help make this shit make sense. Because you can react to anything, right? Like, you could read Bartleby the Scrivener and be like, that was the sexiest thing I've ever seen. And you could try to make an argument that Bartleby the Scrivener is pornography. But just because you have a feeling about something, just because you react, doesn't mean it's the truth, right? Preferences can't be wrong. I can say I like Bartleby, I don't like Bartleby. That's whatever. You can't really prove or disprove that. Some opinions are false, though, and grounded in false understandings of things and mistaken. What's the word? Mistaken definitions, shit like that. Tired of this thing reflecting my manga. So, if. Well, how do I know if my reactions make sense? Usually, your reaction is related to something. If you thought somehow that Bartleby the Scrivener was a sexy story and a pornographic one, then it becomes an investigation of specific kinks and what is triggering that reaction. A good example to use, I think, is the original text of The Watchmen, if you've ever read the comic book, or seen the movie, ideally if you've seen both. Because you can watch the movie of The Watchmen, and it's, it's an action story, there's some drama, and you sit through it and you're like, that was a cool superhero movie. But then if you go to the material, the original text, you'll read it and it's not like that at all. It's actually kind of mundane and humbling as opposed to the way motherfuckers were punching through brick fireplaces with their bare hands and shit. And you'll read it and you'll go, that was very different from the movie. What the fuck? So then you read about Alan Moore and you read about what he thinks about superheroes and his experience in comic books, and you can reasonably come to the conclusion, now that you've got the background knowledge, that Alan Moore wrote Watchmen to decry what he saw as the sort of fascist nature of superheroes and our reaction to them. And then it got turned into a movie that kind of made the opposite point. And there's like a lot of different small kind of ways you can gain that evidence. If you remember when we were talking about Phyllis Wheatley, I made a point that if you read her poetry and you understand that it's written in iambic pentameter, then you can think about the history of iambic pentameter back to Alexander Pope and shit, and you can say Phyllis Wheatley, as a black woman writing in antebellum America, arguing against enslavement, is using the form of her poetry to place herself in this historical lineage of formalist poets like Alexander Pope and other deeply respected poets of the time in order to bolster her argument and align it artistically with beloved authors. And all that is to say that she's trying to use this shit to make a specific point that will be received by her audience of white people, mostly. It's a really particular and small point. Well, I don't want to say small, but it's very particular. And it relies on having a lot of particular, I don't know, I keep using that word. It relies on having expertise with poetry and poetic traditions, formats, and etc. And it also relies on me having a knowledge of Phyllis Wheatley, as in who she is as a person and her historical context when she began her work. And also, the nature of the history of poetry in general and America's relationship to it. So I'm activating a whole lot of background knowledge as well as to take a look at my reaction to her work to come to a conclusion. So when I come to that conclusion, then what? Then you read back over the story and you look at the particular moments that pushed you towards the conclusion that you made about the theme or the tale or the text. And that's how you develop a paper. Well, ideally for our purposes, the extra step is you're going to take this conclusion and pull it forward into a modern moment. And the reason for that is, what is the point of us reading The Last of the Mohicans? Well, I'm not going to use that because that might be more easily relevant. what is the point of us reading something like Sinners in the hands of an angry God, right? Like, you can read a story that's over 200 years old and just say, cool story, bro, and keep it moving. If we're going to study literature in the context of the history of the country, then we need to understand the literature and the meaning of the literature in the context of the present moment, because history leads us to today, and the past specifically informs and creates the future, or the present, I guess. And then we spend that understanding and knowledge to create a future. If we just dumbly read through Bartleby the Scrivener, cool story, bro, set it aside and keep it moving, what was the point, right? There was no lesson to be learned. There was nothing to be gained. It was just exposure to some shit, a narrative. And that has no weight. That has no meaning. We, as critics, make meaning from the stories that we read. And we make that meaning based on our reactions to it and our analysis of those reactions and how we got there. And then using the background knowledge and stuff that we have to expand it and make it relevant to the people that we're speaking to. So, ultimately, I think we need all of this shit in order to make it meaningful. And I guess I would say that's sort of the beginning of making a criticism in general. And this is why earlier on in the semester too, I was kind of saying it doesn't really matter what the author intends, because there's no fucking way that Christopher Columbus could have foreseen what today's world is going to be like. It's impossible. So if I know that he can't have that kind of superhuman wisdom and foresight, who cares? Who cares why he wrote it, except if it matters to my reaction to it now. If I read, I don't use Phyllis Wheatley, but I can't think of, was it Fenimore? Let me see. Might not have been. Oh, right, okay. Well, I'll go with it. If I read Last of the Mohicans, and my immediate reaction is to think about, oh man, I lost it. Gee whiz. If I read Last of the Mohicans, and the first thing I think about is the Dakota Pipeline protests, right? Then that's meaningful. That means that there is a connection. And I'm going to think about what Fenimore Cooper wanted to do, and how his intentions might have carried out or been carried forward throughout time. But I'm not going to be a slave to his intentions, because there's no way he could have known what the world would be like this far ahead. Ironically, this kind of turns into an argument about amending the Constitution, right? Because specifically, we could say, if you're studying the Constitution, there's no way that the Founding Fathers would have been able to imagine semi-automatic machine guns. They lived in a world of muskets. A Glock would be like a wizard wand to them. Here, Tommy, you're a wizard, and they hand him a pistol. How do I say this appropriately, reasonably? We can't revere authors as gods or geniuses. They're just people with their own flaws, coping with the moment as best they can. And when it's all said and done, and we're dust, and if the world is around in 200 years, people are reading the shit that we wrote, they're going to do the same thing that we're doing now. They're going to be reading us to understand where we're coming from at the moment through the lens of their own personal reactions and the study that they've accumulated over time. That's why I say I'm not going to choose a topic for you for the final paper, because you need your background knowledge in order to be able to give a genuine critique and interpretation of a work. If I tell you to write about if I ask you to write about how Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is like a pro wrestling promo to build up for a main event or something, I mean, maybe you could do it, but you wouldn't really know what the hell I'm talking about in the first place. You would need to study, what is a promo. You would need to probably watch examples. Then you need to do the work of comparing the two and eventually figuring out what you have to say. I think it's much more natural for you to follow your impulses based on what you've read and then move forward with that. So with Bartleby the Scrivener, a lot of the common interpretations might be, and I'm not going to say too much, I'm just going to float these to you and see how you feel. Because Bartleby the Scrivener is a story that takes place in the workplace, and because Bartleby ultimately dies at the end, you might have an anti-capitalist reading of Bartleby the Scrivener, where you're saying, because you react like, oh shit, this is fucked up, and he dies, you could say, I don't know, Bartleby the Scrivener ultimately shows the dangers of alienation. And that alienation occurs because of capitalism. I mean, after all, we're just human resources to the machine, right? And nobody in Bartleby had an actual name except for Bartleby himself. He was alone in the workplace. No one really knew each other. And then he dies, sad and by himself. And the narrator's trying to reach out to him, but by then it's too late. And he doesn't even reach out to him appropriately, potentially. Depends on what you think. Or you could say Bartleby the Scrivener is a story about clinical depression and what it looks like to watch someone give up on their life so gradually and completely that they refuse to eat to death and allow themselves to starve. All this stuff is based on your initial reaction and you parsing out your feelings. So it requires a degree of sensitivity and emotional intelligence to know how you're feeling. It also, in the first place, even before that, it requires actual engagement. Like, you've got to dig deep and read into this shit. The discussion boards are sort of a practice for that, where you read over this stuff, you respond, and ideally you're sorting out your feelings so that you can see where you're coming from, gather the evidence that you need, both from the text and from outer sources. Like, if you're going to write about Bartleby the Scrivener being about clinical depression, then we would need psychiatry sources, right, about clinical depression and how it manifests, as well as information from the text itself. So, takes a lot of teamwork between your background knowledge and what you're already aware of, your sensitivity and engagement with the story or the text, and your ability to locate what things in the tale or the story or the text or the narrative, whatever, led you to that emotional conclusion. And then you make the argument to us about why it's meaningful today. Because, of course, clinical depression would be meaningful today. Of course, an anti-capitalist argument would be meaningful today. Again, this is where the research can come in. Hell, you could probably even combine those two ideas. So, I think I've covered all the points that I hit in the first recording. Hopefully this one works out. And see you Monday.